Hello, John Bloodworth here with the second part of this exploration into mixed media, numbered part 4, but it is the second part based on last week's, where I promised you I would show you some different things that you could do after you'd done your jelly plate prints. Now the first one was just a quick one and it was showing you that you could stamp on these, but you're probably best using an archival ink because that will set permanently onto plastic, which is essentially what acrylic paint is. Next up, I'm going to move on to using some dimensional pastes. Now there are all sorts, and you can even use polyfiller or filler. Use a fine one if you can get it. Now spatulas are a very good thing for this, but you can use old credit cards or whatever you've got around. And basically you just take a little bit and smush it down through the stencil. Depending on the liquidity, I'm sure that's a word, viscosity, that's the better word, in fact that's an official word, depending on that will depend on the result that you get. So this one's quite a liquid paste, so there will be some seepage below the stencil. You might be able to get around it by using a stencil adhesive, but that can pull your paint, so I tend not to use it. So there we go. That's the first one. You can see there's a little bit of seepage, but not too bad with this one, so I'm quite happy with that. Let's try another one. I'll use these. Now, I did intend to use the Sweet Poppy stencil paste, but it's actually turned into a gloopy mess. I live in a cabin in the woods, basically, and my only heating is from a log fire, so that can mess with all sorts of things when it comes to your mediums. So it's not a bad thing. I then reached for the polyfiller, but I realised I'd bought this years ago, and unfortunately the bottom end is set solid. So not so great so far, but you can use them under normal circumstances. So the one thing that hasn't really been affected is my Pebeo modelling paste, so I use that. Some pastes do dry clear, some dry white. Read the labels, check what you want, and basically buy according to those needs. This particular one dries white, so you might want to use some kind of paste over the top, and I will be doing that later. But basically it also dries so that it's absorbent. So if you do use things like watercolours or wax paints, then it will dry in a way that you can use those. Now this paste, which is by the same company that I used the gold, was actually starting to congeal. So I thought, what about if I mix in some of the modelling paste just to really add some viscosity back into it? And believe it or not, I saved it. It worked. So just mixing in a little with the top layer, and I got a beautiful texture paste. In fact, at the very right consistency that I needed. Not too liquid that it would seep through, but squishy enough that it will go through the stencil and hold its shape. How fabulous. I must remember that tip for myself for later on, so that I don't have to throw out any other modelling pastes. Look how defined that is. Amazing. Very nice. Set that off to dry. Now what's next? Okay, after my disaster with crackle paste last week, I thought I'll give it another go. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But hey ho, the result that I got actually, I kind of liked. I'm just basically spreading a thin layer. It says just to brush in one direction, so that's why I'm not sort of going all over the place. And then basically I left that to dry somewhere where I could stick my elbow in it. Now you can see all these different prints that I pulled. Basically any of these will work with these techniques. You choose your colours and your finishes and really just go to town. This that I'm using right now is a relief paste, and that's because I wanted to basically drop some glazes into it. So you can draw something out, go freehand, whatever you want to do. You're just basically creating a border that will hold some kind of dimensional liquid medium. Now the Bindex I've mentioned before, this is basically a clear, I guess you could say it's a clear acrylic paint. It's basically just a liquid that you would secure different papers or different mediums to something. So I've just ripped off that that I ripped up, by the way, was actually one of the waste sheets. Now I've got a bit too much Bindex there, so I thought I'd better scrape off some, otherwise it's going to be a proper mess. So basically what I generally do, this is how I use it, is I do a thin layer to stick the paper down and then seal it with a top coat. That then seals in everything underneath it. Doing a couple of these, and then I suddenly had an idea, what about if I mix in a tiny little bit of acrylic paint and create like a glaze with it? Wondered if it worked. And it did. You can see there that it just creates a very translucent coloured layer over the top, which can sort of knock back very intense colours and picks up the brush strokes nicely too. The magic of editing, all that mess has just been cleared up. Now I'm using a bog standard PVA glue here, so it's quite a liquid PVA, not like a bookbinding glue. It's just a general wet glue. And I'm using that to spread thin layers. You can use this to print with and to do all sorts with, really. And I'm going to use hot foils, but you can use contact foils as well, just to basically stick down on there. I'm not being too careful with where I place it or thinking about it too much. It's just really to get it on there and then leave it to dry. I'm spreading some onto a rubber stamp. You can brayer it on, or even just pick the glue up from the block or whatever you've put it on with the stamp, stamping that onto the print, and then putting a piece of foil over the top, again just to come into contact with the glue. I'm not really trying to smush it and spread it, but do make sure to wash your stamp straight afterwards. Don't let that glue dry on the stamp. Now, interference ink created some interest the other week, so I just wanted to go over that again. This is a great way of adding some very eye-catching detail, let's say, to a colour or to whatever, and it's basically a very, very fine mica in a translucent or transparent binder. So when you paint it on in very thin layers, A, it picks up your brush strokes, and B, it allows the colour from underneath to shine through. So on the warm colours, it will obviously come through as a very warm gold, but you can see here on this one, it comes through as quite a sort of almost a silvery gold. And it will only really pick up the light when it comes into contact with it. That's what I mean, isn't it? Anyway. And obviously the thickness also makes a difference. So you could do one layer, spread it thin, or do one thick layer, or do several thin layers. Really, just play with it and find out what works. Looks amazing on darker colours. While it's still wet, you can also lift it from whatever you've painted it onto. So just grab a stamp, smush it down, and then pull it up. Excuse me. While I'm on this mega mixed media thing, do something like this if you can, whether it's ATC cards or MDF shapes. Just make yourself little swatches and keep notes of what you've used. It's a great way of just being able to look back and pull out ideas for future projects. There's all sorts going on in this particular swatch pack. I've got crackle paste, which again is from Pebeo. dry brushing effects, eggshells that is, believe it or not, sealed in with Bindex and then brushed over, sanding back, dimensional pastes, all sorts going on. Sorry for knocking the camera. Now here's that crackle paste attempt from earlier. As you can see, it hasn't dried quite well. It's quite cold up here today, so things aren't drying too quickly. But if you take a low viscosity paint, low viscosity, high viscosity, basically a liquidy paint, and then just smear it over the top, potentially some crackling will happen, although actually I quite liked what was going on there already. Now I've got these, which are basically mixed media, can't remember what they're called, but they're basically called Prism or Moon, and they give you different effects. They've got an alcohol binder, which can separate, which is why you see me mixing these thoroughly here with a cocktail stick, but then mica included. And when they're drying, this all moves around, so they give you very different effects. And basically I'm just using a cocktail stick to put that into where I put that relief paste earlier. You can drop it in with a pipette, as I say, or paint it on as well for a different effect. Lots of things that you can do with these. They're worth looking out for. I think I've used them quite a bit in the past on the blog, so it might be worth looking back there. As you can see, that's starting to move around and feather and blotch. Now you can obviously shove as many of those different things as you want in there, or as I've shown you here, just drizzle it straight onto the cardstock or the paint, smear it, spread it, drag some what are they called, basically like a comb, things with teeth in them, drag them through, create all sorts of different effects. If you smear them, obviously there'll be a lot more of the clear binder, so there will be some translucency and transparency going on. If you spread them in a thick layer, like I'm doing here, more of the mica will be present. So however you want to use those. Now here's the results of some of those foiling experiments from earlier. So the glue basically went on and then just rip off whatever's not stuck. That's the one where I used the stamp. Some of the glue was still wet, so it's actually rubbed off, but that's fine. Looks distressed. Now, working on top of what we've already worked on, basically wax pastes are a great way of sealing things or of adding extra little bits of dimension or luster. This particular one is just a blue wax paste. So you spread it on and it will basically start picking up some of the detail and dull things down. Some wax pastes have mica inclusions as well, so as you spread them they will leave a very fine layer. I'm not showing it here, but you can actually heat these so you burn off the wax binder as well, so it becomes a lot more permanent and you don't necessarily end up rubbing wax paste over everything else. So here's that dimensional paste that I made earlier, and you can see how as you dry brush it, it picks up the edges of whatever's in relief. Doopy-doopy-doo. And again, you can kind of layer these together as well. So if the gold comes out too intense, you could pick something that's very similar to the background and then work that over the top, and they will mix and blend with each other and tone each other down. And again, because this is almost like an interference layer, it will only really show up as you look at it in particular lighting conditions. So there's a whole bunch of ideas. I've put them as ATC cards here, so I'll give you a run through. This was that modelling paste that dries white, and I put a pink wax layer over the top. That was the dimensional paste, and we've just seen that one. So that's through a stencil with paste. There's some of the foiling. There's a swatch of the one where I used the golden pink paste. This was just a very light stamping over the top. There's that paint effect, which was supposed to be crackle. The lifted interference paint. Some more foiling. This was basically just a single pull with a stencil. There's the Bindex sealing something down. This, I dry brushed some paint over a crushed piece of paper and then flattened it. And then more stamping towards the end. Okay, that's it for this one. Hope you've enjoyed it and got some ideas, and I hope you'll join me again next week. Thanks for watching.